Hello and welcome to the next lecture. In this lecture, I just want to get everyone on board with writing functions because functions play a critical role in any R programming, and you tend to write a lot of them when you are doing a lot of data analysis or doing a lot of statistical analysis. And so I just want to make sure that everyone can kind of get started writing functions, and particularly for those who are less familiar with programming languages in general. So this is just going to be about writing your first function. It's kind of like the hello world, so to speak, of R. So the first thing you are going to want to do is you are going to want to write the function in a text file. Alright, it's possible to write functions on the command line in R, but it is usually not preferable. So usually you are going to want to put your functions in a separate file, separate from any interactive stuff that you are doing in the command line. In the future, you will want to put your functions in an R package, which is a kind of more structured type of environment with documentation and everything. But we won't talk about that now. Right now, the first thing you are going to want to do is put your functions in a text file. Okay, so the first thing we are going to want to do is open up Rstudio. So let's do that. You can see here in Rstudio, there's some stuff going on here from a previous lecture in Rstudio. So that may happen to you, and generally you can either close it or you can just ignore it. I wanted to create a new R script here, so let's create a clean script here to put our code into. So the first function I'm going to write is really simple. It's just going to take two numbers and add them together. So this function obviously doesn't have a real point to it, but it shows you how to use the function syntax, how to specify the arguments, and how to return the value. So the function that adds two values, I'm just going to call it add2, and so you get it. You use the function directive to start it off. Now it's going to add two values, so it has to take two arguments. So I'm just going to call the two arguments x and y here, and then I'm going to take the two arguments and add them together with a plus sign. Alright, x plus y, and then I close out the function with the curly brace. So you can see that I didn't have to do anything special to return the value. That's the sum of the two elements, because our function returns whatever the last expression was. So here there's only one expression. So therefore it's the last expression, and it equals the sum of x and y. So here I can highlight this and run it in the console, and you can see now I've got my function here. I can call add2, and let's give it say 3 and 5, and hopefully I get 8. Yes, it's a good sign. So it adds the two numbers together, and that's that. So it's a very simple function, and you have now written your first function in R. The next function that I want to talk about is a little slightly more complicated. It's going to take a vector of numbers, and then it's going to return the subset of the vector that's above the vector value of 10. So any number that's bigger than 10, it's going to return those numbers for you. We'll call this one above 10, just because it gives you any number that's above 10. And it's going to take a vector here. We'll call it x. You don't have to call it x, I'm just calling it that. And I like to open and close the curly braces right away, just so you know where the beginning and the end of the function is if you happen to have a lot of code in a single file. So the first thing I'm going to want to do is I want to construct a logical statement that figure out which elements of this vector x are greater than 10. Alright, so I'm going to assign an object. I'll call it use, because these are the numbers that I'm going to use, and I'll say x greater than 10. Alright, so this will return a logical vector of true and falses, indicating which element of x is greater than 10. And then I'm going to subset the vector x with this logical vector. So now this function will return the subset of the vector x that is bigger than 10. Of course, if there are no elements of x that are bigger than 10, then it will return an empty numeric vector. Now, of course, there's really nothing special about the number 10. I just kind of made that up, and so you may want to create a function that allows people to kind of extract the elements of a vector that are above an arbitrary other number, right? And so it could be 10, it could be 12, or it could be 5, it could be anything. So maybe you will want to allow the user to specify that number. So I'll just I'll create a new function here, which I will call above. So it doesn't have the 10 encoded in it. I'll use the function directive. I'll have a x same as before, which will be a list, and I'll have a second arbitrary vector called n here, which can be any number really. So let's start it off. We'll get the curly braces in there, and now I'll create a logical statement that x is greater than n, right? And then I'll subset the vector x based on that logical statement. So now if I source this function here, oops, I made a mistake here. Let me correct it. Okay, it's fine now. I'll source it again, and now I can run my function here. So I'll just create a vector, let's say x, which is 1 through 20, hit enter, and I'll say above x. Oh, you see, so I didn't specify the number n, so it's not going to know what to cut it off at. So I need to specify the threshold. So let's do 12, and you can see it returned all the numbers that are greater than 12. So that's it as we expected, and so the function appears to be working well. Now let's suppose that maybe there is something special about the number 10, and maybe it's something that people are going to be kind of doing very often, and it's a very common number. So you might want to specify a default argument. So you might want to the default to be 10. So remember when I ran the function before and I didn't specify the number n, it gave me an error, or maybe you don't want people to have to encounter that error, and so you will specify a default value, let's say n equals 10. So when people don't specify the cutoff value n, it will just automatically default to 10. So now I can run this code in R, and now if I do above, which is x, so you see I don't get the error anymore. It automatically gives you all the numbers that are bigger than 10. So it's kind of nice in R when you are writing functions to be able to specify default values like this that make the life of the user just a little bit easier, especially for very common cases where it's not important that the user specify an argument. So those are some very simple functions in R that can be used to kind of process data or make do simple calculations like adding two numbers. Now the next function I want to talk about is just going to take a matrix or a data frame and calculate the mean of each column, right? So this is slightly more complicated. You have to take your argument and then you have to loop through each column to calculate the mean of each one, right? So this is going to involve using a for loop, and so we will talk about it here. So let's call this function column mean because that's what it does, and I'll use the function directive here. Now it's going to take an argument. I like to call my arguments x, but you don't have to, so why don't we just call it y for fun? And so y is going to be a data frame or a matrix, and we are going to go through the columns of this data frame or matrix and calculate the mean of each column. So the first thing I need to figure out is how many columns does this thing have, and that can be easily done. I'll call it nc for number of columns, and we can use the ncall function for that. That will calculate the number of columns, and then I need to initialize a vector that's going to store the means for each column. The length of this vector has to equal the number of columns, right? So I just called it means, and it will be a numeric vector equal to the number of columns. So this is just an empty vector. It's going to be initialized to be all zeros, but we are going to fill it as we go through the column. So now we want to for loop through the columns, and I'll say I is in, and then I'll say 1 through nc. So this creates an integer vector that starts from 1 and ends at the number of columns. And then I'm going to for loop through, and for each I'm just going to assign to my means vector the mean of y bracket comma and then I. So it will calculate the mean of each column including all rows. As we did here, we didn't specify the number of rows, so it will include all rows for each column. And that's it. And then so far I haven't returned anything yet. So right now this function doesn't do anything particularly useful, but what I want to do is return the vector of means, and so I'm just going to return that. And since that's the last expression in the function, that is what will get returned. So I can source this into R, and I'll just find some arbitrary data set. We can use the air quality data set, I guess. I'll just take the column means of that and see how it works. Okay, so I think there are 6 columns in this data set, so it gave me 6 means. Now you can see that the first 2 columns have NAs, and that's because if the vector has an NA in it, then you cannot calculate the mean. And so the one thing you might want to do is by default throw out all of the missing values and just calculate the mean amongst the observed values. And so you will notice that a lot of functions have a feature where you can choose whether you want to remove the ns or not. But let me just add up an argument here. It's called rm.na and it will default to true, right? And then I'll pass this argument to the main function. So the main has an na.rm argument and I will pass at this value. And so now I can default or remove the ns when I calculate my column mean. So sources sent to R with the run in the console column mean. And now I get my means for those two columns as well, because the default was to remove the ns. I could say false here and then my ns will come back. So I can always choose to kind of go back to the old behavior if I wanted to. So the last thing you want to do anytime you're writing a function, the most important thing of course is to save your file. So right now this file is unsaved. If you don't save it and Rstudio crashes or something happens, you will lose all your work. And so you want to go to the save, I meant save as menu, and just save your file as functions or whatever you want to call it, and give it the .r extension. And now your code is saved to a file. So that should get you started just writing some simple functions in R for your programming assignment that are posted daily in our blog post with each topic. And you will have to write a few functions that kind of go through and look at data, because I just wanted to get you started writing your first functions so that you know kind of how the function directive works, how the arguments work, and you can play around a little bit with more complicated ideas as you work through the assignments. See you in the next lecture.